So I should probably address the elephant within the room. Next week is the final chapter of Chainsaw Man. So yes, it is coming to a conclusion. It's a little bit odd, that's for sure. A lot of us were hoping that this would go on longer. I was holding on to the idea that the cohesive ties that Fujimoto did add would actually give some sort of context or length to continue the story. Mixed with the success and the reception for Chainsaw Man specifically, everything seemed like it was going in that direction. However, Fujimoto is his own person. I respect his decisions, and for now it seems like he felt like the story was done. As much as I don't necessarily agree with his decision to end the story because of the stuff that he's just recently added, I respect it, and I understand that maybe he doesn't want to do it anymore. Maybe he's bored, maybe he wants to do other things. Even though we are getting the final chapter next week, one thing that makes me extremely curious is what was with all of the issues surrounding its ending. There were so many misleaks and mistranslated rumors and just a whole lot of weird things surrounding the final arc, final conclusion, super climax, final phase of the story. And then the only legitimate response that we got from Chainsaw Man's editor was that the story was entering its final phase. That was a damn lie. This is not a final phase. This is legitimately the final chapters. So it makes me curious on why they even marketed these events as the final phase when you could have got even better marketing with saying that these are the final chapters, and the reception would have been even more massive. Everyone would have been talking about it, but instead it's framed as a final phase when it's not, and then you get this weird abrupt, oh by the way, next week is the final chapter. It's very odd in my eyes, and I don't want to claim some sort of conspiracy or even hypothetically build upon that, but it just seems there's a lot of weird things going on, and I'm just kind of hoping that if there is something along those lines for whatever reason, I'm hoping Fujimoto is the one that's kind of in control, that the reason that this story is ending is because he's bored, or he wants to do something else, which I can't blame him for. Now we have it, final chapter next week. I do have some loose hope that maybe this is a Tokyo Ghoul Re situation, and that the final phase that they actually legitimately promoted is the next part of the story. That the final phase may be its own separate thing. So they end the story and then they do some Chainsaw Man Re or part 2 for example, and that's the final phase. Nothing necessarily implies that it would do that, only the cohesive ties that he added, but obviously Fujimoto, just by experience with myself reading Fire Punch recently, he doesn't really seem to care about those things. So you get an ending like this where it's just a little bit underwhelming and could have been a whole lot better. But I mean, it's actually rather impressive with how the story has gone and how quickly he wants to end it. It's well managed. I'm actually more impressed than disappointed, which very weird to say considering there's a lot of things within here that I wish he did play upon, and I'm very weird about why he even introduced them to begin with when he decided to end the series only 5 to 6 chapters later. I'm impressed with what he managed to pull out, and whether or not we get a part 2 is kind of just wishful thinking, so only time will tell. But there is a big announcement next week. It's probably more than likely going to be an anime announcement or something along those lines, I'd hope. So at least there's probably some good news there for us as Chainsaw Man fans and people that love and enjoy the series. So like I said, this chapter is somewhat impressive, not only because it kind of brings things pretty much to a conclusion, but how quickly it does it, and how even though a lot of different things that should be played upon, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the primordial fears, the power situation which takes time to build emphasis for, Makima's goals and the fuel for that in itself, there's a lot of different things that should have been expanded upon and for some reason were added into the story only like a handful of chapters ago, like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I'm still confused on why he even added those to begin with, because you realistically didn't even have to. You didn't have to frame the power situation that way. You could have done it completely differently, and this ending right now would have been better in its entirety. But even though we know all of these things and stuff that could have been played upon and what could have been, he actually does a pretty impressive job to make you forget about it all. And this chapter somewhat just wipes a lot of things under the table. The final chapter can somewhat fill it in more, but it's a little bit pointless because you're playing relying on it within the final chapters. So the same chapter you bring it in is the same chapter you take it out, and it's kind of really redundant to do it like that. Look, Fujimoto is just unpredictable. Let's just put it as that. There's actually a pretty interesting plot twist within this chapter, which I didn't actually expect. Chainsaw Man, as we know it, got absolutely obliterated by Makima in the previous chapter with ease, mind you, hand-to-hand combat, which was extremely impressive, but turns out there's a little bit more to that situation and to that Denji specifically. So while Makima's here kind of reveling in her success and her victory over Chainsaw Man and looking at Pochita's heart, which very cutely is just vibing away, but within the background we see a body slowly rising up, and turns out it's actually Denji. And to implement this twist and to make it even more prominent and impactful is that the panel that we get of Denji holding a legitimate chainsaw and about to cut Makima is a direct parallel to the first bit of like volume art I believe we got, or the first cover where Denji is holding up a chainsaw and Makima is reflected within that chainsaw blade. I thought it was a nice, beautiful touch just to add in there, this chapter paralleling that very first piece of colored artwork that we got, which is incredible and which introduced everyone to Chainsaw Man's story. And obviously this results in Makima getting heavily injured, basically cut right down the middle and leaving a massive gash. And you would think Makima would respond rather quickly to this. Not actually the case. This whole situation right now has been orchestrated. And it's right to say that Makima has been well and truly duped. She has been swindled and she has not even realized it. The Denji or Chainsaw Man that Makima was fighting and eventually killed was a duplicate. At least that's somewhat how Denji explains it. He vaguely remembers a way of using Pochita's heart as pretty much as a core, so he could materialize around it and a body could be grown around it. So it seems like what he done is use a previous heart, which I don't know if he can grow them out, or if this is specifically from the situation regarding space where he threw his own heart out and materialized around it, basically teleporting to his heart and taking that concept and playing upon it. The Denji we're seeing now is a legitimate one. The chainsaw blade that he actually has and cut Makima with is made from Power's blood, so it's extremely intrusive, very similar to like a viral infection starting to eat away at Makima's blood, as that is what Power actually is, a blood devil. We see the acknowledgement of Denji knowing that he won't be able to kill Makima like this, and we see Kishibe rock up in a van and Denji pointing the Chainsaw Man back down at Makima with a very specific goal in mind. The next thing we know, we're back to a bit of normalcy, or at least you could somewhat call it that. Denji's back in his own apartment. Kishibe's framing this situation as being a lot bigger than I actually would have ever expected, as it's a very massive process to do what Denji is about to do. They have a very interesting conversation, more specifically about Makima and how impossible she is to kill realistically, which still makes me question how she can actually be killed by Denji devouring her this way. In my mind, I always thought that he would have to be within the Chainsaw Man form to be able to do it, to erase her from existence, but it seems a little odd when you place Kishibe's context in here, even though he should know what Chainsaw Man is capable of, and Denji should know what Chainsaw Man is capable of in terms of erasing things from existence, yet none of them actually imply that Makima is going to be erased. So it's somewhat up in the air on what the results of the actions they're about to take is even meant to be, especially when Kishibe tells Denji to reinforce and steel himself for failure and death. Brings up some rather interesting ideas that could be played upon, but not necessarily, because final chapter next week. From here we get some sort of cooking monologue with Denji reflecting on the situation in itself, reflecting on Makima, reflecting on his friends, and trying to understand the whole situation, especially going through the process of how he would actually kill Makima and bring it to a conclusion, and the hurdles he went through trying to think about that. Then we get this very specific panel of some food and some meaty ribs, which is Makima. This is the way Denji's going to devour her, the way he's going to kill her. Super simple, but extremely effective and actually rather impactful. I think a situation like this would fit a lot better in like 60 chapters time. Imagine all of this being framed by Denji not having anyone. And when I say not having anyone, I don't mean Kobeni or Kishibe or the remnants of power and her blood being used right after an extremely harsh battle with Primordial Fears, Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, even Makima again. This meal would represent so much, and even even now it does represent so much. Because the way he reacts to this meal says a lot about Denji's character. You remember the times when he was so energetic about just eating literally anything, to the point where vomit was somewhat okay with him. Not only does it show how far he's come within his life, where the value of things are starting to shift and change, which food like this, rice, miso soup, and makima based ribs, lingers in the path of just being alright. 90 odd chapters ago, this would have been a masterpiece. This would have been heaven itself. Especially, even on top of that, it's based around Makima, and with his complete affection and admiration for her, this would have been 10 times better. But the way he eats it is very monotone. It's very cold-faced and pretty average, to be honest. He says it tastes just alright. I think that shows a lot about how far Denji has come. The facial expressions within this chapter and just him as a character within this chapter is so completely different to what he was in the previous one. He's not necessarily the same Denji he once was. Every moment of him within this chapter felt like something we've never seen before. And this is because of his change in mental state, his change in emotions. Things have evolved further than what we could have ever imagined. The life within Denji seems a lot more hollowed over now. It's not as flirtatious or effective. It's not as bright or even bubbly. In comparison to the events that he goes through, the personality that he upholds is very fun and energetic, but this Denji here is cold and borderline depressing. I could also say that it's actually rather mature, but going through forceful maturity is a very dangerous thing and could have easily been played upon and explored upon, but final chapter once again next week, just to rub the salt in the wounds a little bit more. But I think this chapter was nice. I think it's impressive how Fujimoto was able to wrap it up this way, with so many things kind of left out in the open, and he still somewhat funneled it in rather nicely. Is it the best ending in the world? Of course not, and we still have one more chapter, but I do think it's something that people can be somewhat satisfied with. It's definitely not the massive, climatic or well thought out ending that I'm pretty sure a lot of us wanted, but if an ending like this means that Fujimoto is happy with what he's doing, or if he can finally take a break or whatever it may be that eventually supports him, by all means, I'm more than happy to take this ending. And in reality, it's actually a lot better than what I thought it could have been. Very close to being some sort of train wreck. I'm very interested to see what happens next week, what the final chapter is going to be, and what the announcement could be. Only time will tell. So with that being said, that is basically it. Let me know how you felt about this chapter and how do you feel about Chainsaw Man ending next week. I'm sure a lot of you have some very massive words to say about it, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Drink plenty of water, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.